Hello, and welcome to the Metta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast, and today we're here with episode 257, continuing with our 7th episode of the Fireside Chat Series. Today, Sharon is talking to Christina Feldman, a much beloved Dharma teacher. So this series is hosted by IMS Online, which is the online branch of the Insight Meditation Society. It's a series that features intimate conversations with longtime Dharma teachers about the early days of their practice, some of the most impactful moments they've had with their own teachers, and also the evolution of their teaching. So we're happy to be back with another episode. And Christina is of that generation of Dharma teachers who began teaching in the West in the mid-70s after spending some years in Asia studying. She's practiced both in the Mahayana tradition as well as Theravadan. She is the co-founder of Gaia House and has been involved with IMS since the early days, serving as a guiding teacher there for many years. She is also the author of many books, including Boundless Heart, The Buddha's Path of Kindness, Compassion, Joy, and Equanimity, and co-author of Mindfulness, Ancient Wisdom Meets Modern Psychology. Christina starts things off with a guided meditation, and then they dive into a very personal, very deep conversation, starting with how Christina accidentally ended up in India, and a lot of detail on how she first started meditating, what that was like for her. And really that period of time in the mid-70s, Sharon also talks about some of her first attempts at meditation and about S.N. Goenka, who was Sharon's primary teacher in those early days, and the impact that he had on her. They go on to talk about practice versus path, as well as secular mindfulness, and spend a lot of time on the many definitions of the Pali word dukkha, which is most commonly translated to mean suffering. Christina shares about kind of what she's been doing in her teaching lately, all these many years later, her work at Bodhi College, and a fair amount about the practice of equanimity, really approaching equanimity as an embodied understanding, an embodied way of being. The conversation then segues to a whole question and answer session with folks from the live event, and also another guided meditation. So we're happy to be back. This might be our last of the fireside chats, to be revealed. We'll see. But you can enjoy this one while it's here. Before we get to the conversation, we are getting closer and closer to the start of Sharon's Real Happiness Meditation Challenge, starting in just a few days, February 1st. And if you don't know this program, we've been doing it for about 15 years now. It's a month-long challenge that is based on Sharon's book by the same name, Real Happiness. And it's really aimed to empower you with a home meditation practice. Every day is a different guided meditation. Sharon teaches concentration, mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of emotions, as well as loving kindness. So if you've been wanting to get your feet wet in the world of meditation and really start a personal practice, I highly recommend. And the other motivation is if you are just looking to kind of rejuvenate your home practice, this is a great way to do it. It's a huge community from all over the world that will be doing this, so there's a lot of that collective energy to help support the practice. And the last thing I'll mention about it is we offer this challenge on a sliding scale basis. So there's unlimited scholarships. We suggest $1 a day donation, but some people give more, some people give less. We really don't want money to be an obstacle to you participating, and especially if you're reeling from recent events, recent climate disasters. We know there's a lot going on in the world and that this can be just a supportive space for you. So please come join us. And you can learn all about it at Sharon's website. That's SharonSalzberg.com. Okay, so let's get into today's pod. Christina Feldman and Sharon Salzberg.
Hi, I'm very excited as well for this. Was really an international call. I love reading where everyone is signing in from. And welcome, Christina. It's so great to see you. So Christina's going to start us off with a short meditation.
Yes, also a very warm welcome from me. It's always a lovely moment when the screens suddenly light up and I see plenty of familiar faces and those I don't know. So, as Sharon mentioned, we have time to have a chat today, something we haven't had a chance to do since pre-pandemic. So it's going to be good for us, nice for us. So why don't we take just a minute or two just to sit together and gather ourselves so that we can land collectively in this space. Place for some reflection, some listening, some questioning. In a climate of spaciousness and stillness and kindness, arriving in your body, arriving in this moment together. Exploring the possibilities of calming, of stilling, of befriending this moment, however it is. Grounding ourselves in the body. So thank you. So we have some space now where Sharon and I will have some time to reflect together, and then there'll be some more open space for you to bring any questions that you have. So I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Thank you. it's always nice to practice together. So we were born a few months apart, you and I, Christina, and I went to India, as I've often talked about, in 1970. It was such an interesting time in the US and many places around the world. Here, the Vietnam War was going on, psychedelics were all happening. Society seemed in a mood of disruption. And Eastern thinking, was getting introduced in a more pronounced way than perhaps had been here previously. And I went as part of this college program in order to learn how to meditate. That was the project that I created. And I think about that time, all those elements of it, society and also one's personal quest very often. And especially I think about, how to actually access practical teaching, like how to meditate, not just enjoy the thought, that it might be possible, but to actually learn how to do it, you needed tremendous motivation of one kind or another because it just wasn't around everywhere. I was going to college in Buffalo, New York. I'd heard about meditation. I looked around Buffalo. I just didn't see it anywhere. It was a very different time. And so one needed, and I remember from the people, some of whom were on this call that I met in India, we all had some kind of very strong motivation because you had to schlep, halfway around the world in many cases, or, put your life together in such a way that you could really explore something so different. And it's very different than it is now. But so let's go back to your first exposure. You went to India around the same time I did, I think. And do you remember your initial motivation and what really led you there?
I mean, I find it fascinating that you and I have a number of friends and colleagues in Europe now who are teaching, that we all went at the same time. Some of us knew each other there. Some of us didn't meet there. And yet all these decades later, I find it quite awesome that we are all still so deeply committed to this path. I think it tells us something about what it's offered to us over the years. I mean, my journey was different than yours, Sharon, because I was an accidental visitor to India. I had no intention of going to India. I happened to be in Europe because I graduated from high school too early to go to college in Canada at that time. So I was meant to be having a year out in Europe, traveling with a couple of friends. And, quite surprisingly, I found myself in a relationship. This is a very personal story, by the way. I found myself in a relationship with this Canadian guy who was going to India. But I still wasn't going to India. I was still continuing my travels with my friends. So we said goodbye to each other, and we all went off our separate ways, him on his way to India and me on my way to Morocco, when he suddenly decided that he really felt he couldn't live without me. So he came looking for me in Europe. Now, Europe's a big place, no cell phones, no email. And lo and behold, he found me on the steps of the Colosseum in Rome and persuaded me to come to India with him. I said, okay, we'll give it a go. And so, yes, I was an accidental visitor to India. And, in those days you went overland. It was a pretty grueling journey, really grueling, through Iran and Afghanistan and Turkey, Pakistan, finally ending up in India. And I disliked it so much. 17 years old, I couldn't deal with the noise and the harassment and the dirt and the poverty. And it was just, I found it overwhelming. So my friend and I, we decided we'd heard about the Tibetan community in the mountains. We'd heard about the Dalai Lama. So we decided to head for the mountains. And we arrived, and I found myself in McLeod where the Dalai Lama had his home. There were still Tibetan refugees coming in. It was a Tibetan community of refugees. And as you can imagine, being a refugee in India was no easy life at all. And yet I was astonished and deeply moved by the kind of heart of this community. I mean, they were so, their hearts were intact. They weren't broken. They had lost so much, their homes. Many had lost their families, their way of life, and landed in India as refugees living on UN rations. And yet their hearts were intact, and they were just extraordinarily generous and had so much joyfulness, and were so welcoming. And when I found myself in this community, in this ethos, I knew very quickly that these folks knew something that I didn't know. They knew a way of being that was, unknown to me. So I decided to try and find out what that was. It was a time when the Dalai Lama had kind of launched this great experiment to see if Westerners could actually meditate, or if Westerners could actually learn anything about the Dharma. There were a lot of doubts around, because we were pretty wild to the Tibetans, So he instructed several of his own tutors to take the Western students on the Westerners on as students. And we weren't very many in McLeod Ganj at that time. It was a very, very small number of Westerners who were up there. Probably only about 12 of us, actually. So he'd instructed his own tutors to take us on. The one that I went to, Geshe Rabden, he was really reluctant to teach Westerners. I used to go every day to his hut, and knock on the door and ask him to take me on as a student. And, he was very grumpy, and he'd say no, 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 and send me away. And, finally, after several weeks, I went, and he gave me a packet of noodles. And apparently that was his way of agreeing to take me on as a student. Which had to be, translated for me. So I began to study with Geshe Rabden. I stayed in McLeod Ganj for several years, basically studying with him, and also with the Dalai Lama and with some of his other tutors. And that was my launching pad. That was my launch pad. That was how I began. I mean, for someone who ended up there as an accident, it immediately became my home. My home. I wasn't really interested in going anywhere else at that time. Yeah, it's so strange.
That's so fascinating. You've undermined my entire theory of strong motivation being not necessarily the case right now, but nonetheless, obviously something in you was responsive, because we also know people who went to India and for whom it was only the sorrow of, the long lines and the inefficiency, or what they felt to be, difficulties and often were, so I'll hold on to my theory, at least to a partial extent, because I'm also interested in, the difference in accessibility now, where, you also said, as was very true, no cell phones, no email, the one sense of the world was really based on what one could see and hear around one. And if you heard about a great teacher, for example, at the other end of India, it's because someone told you about it, or it showed you a photo. You weren't looking up a guidebook, for retreats, or having a website to look at. There was nothing like that. And so there was a kind of intentionality for you to stay there and to open the teaching. So I'm also interested, and I have no answer to it. Like now, because the teachings are so much more accessible and available, what do we all have to do to encourage that same level of investment so it's not just a very casual thing?
But I think for us in India at that time, the Dharma was an immersive experience. It wasn't just something that you did a retreat here or a course there. It was something that was completely immersive. When you talk about, going to India to learn how to meditate, I mean, that was what I was immediately interested in once I started studying, studying with Geshe Rabden. But he actually didn't encourage us really to do much meditation for the first year. His teaching was all about why you want to meditate.
Mm-hmm.
What is your motivation? What is going to sustain you through a lifetime in the Dharma? So the first year was, there were some meditative exercises in terms of visualizations and Lam Rim and all of these different kinds of practices. But a lot of it was about reflection on motivation. And of course, in that community, the primary motivation, or perhaps the only worthwhile motivation considered, was compassion. Everything else was secondary. It was all about how do you develop the level or the depth of compassion to sustain you for a lifetime, through all the rocky times, the easy times, and so a lot of it was really, those kinds of reflections on death, reflections on impermanence, reflections on relationships with others, reflections on integrity, reflections on what compassion looks like and how it can be developed. So that was really almost the kind of really central emphasis in that first year. So, we would go for teachings almost every day. I mean, my teacher was also my neighbor. So, it was almost every day. We would have teachings and a lot about training the mind and, these reflections. But we were also kind of sent home to continue. It wasn't like, okay, you've had your teaching for the day, now go do something else. There wasn't actually anything else to do. There wasn't anything else to do, We didn't have televisions, we didn't have laptops, we didn't have anything. So entertainment value was zero. So there wasn't anything else to do. And, I found myself really loving this. I found myself really loving it, feeling, really, really at home, inspired, not just about what I was listening to, but by the community of people that I was living amongst. Yes, it was about motivation, but it didn't assume that you had the right motivation when you came.
As I listened to you, I recall that he was actually my first teacher as well, but I had a very different karma with the experience. I started out having gone overland in Dharamsala because I was especially interested in learning Buddhist meditation. I heard the Dalai Lama lived there. I heard he was a Buddhist. And there was something so profoundly longing within me for a method, for a way, for a path. And I started going to Geshe Rabden's classes, but it was one of those situations where things just didn't work. I'd show up and they'd say, well, the translator had to go to the dentist who's at the other end of India, so it'll be 2 weeks, So I waited 2 weeks and something else went wrong. And, there was just this feeling within me of like, I need to learn how to do this. And so I ended up having overheard a conversation in a Tibetan restaurant up there in Dharamsala about an international yoga conference in New Delhi. And I thought, oh, I'll go there. I'll find a teacher. Went there. It was a terrible experience, except for Dan Goleman, who years and years later wrote Emotional Intelligence. He happened to be there giving a talk at that conference as a graduate student in psychology from the States. And he mentioned he was on his way to this town called Bodh Gaya to do this intensive 10-day meditation retreat with this man named Goenka, who had just left Burma. And it was a very kind of practical how-to kind of experience. And I thought, oh, maybe that's what I'm looking for. And I went there, and it was just what I was looking for as a beginning, as a foundation. So since you began with this beautiful kind of deeper context and broader context for meditation within the Tibetan world, at some point you got exposed to techniques like insight meditation, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was it was actually probably a doubt crisis. I mean, in many ways, I felt really, I sort of never leave the Tibetan story behind me, because you're always shaped by your early influences. But there were points when I realized that there was quite a dissonance, quite a gap between my ideals and my lived experience. It wasn't hard for me to sit up in the Himalayas and feel compassion for the entire universe. But it was very hard when I got in a bus in Delhi and was getting harassed. So I realized there was this gap between, what I really aspired to and the levels, I think, of psychological, emotional insight that would allow me to embody those ideals. So at one point, actually, Goenka came to Dharamsala to teach the first time there. And as some of you know, that in those days, and actually still today, there was often this kind of competitiveness about who's got the right school. So, a lot of Mahayanas tended to look down on the lesser vehicle, and the lesser vehicle would be, doing their own thing about the so-called greater vehicle. So Goenkaji coming to Dharamsala to teach was quite radical in a very real way. And I did my first 10-day retreat there. And those were different days in how Goenka was teaching than how he taught later on in his teaching life. And, I found it really challenging. That first 10-day retreat, I found it really hard. I found it difficult just to sit all day because they didn't do any walking practice. It was just sit. And, everything in me was complaining and hurting. And yet there was a turning point in the 10 days where, something shifted. And, I did have some real taste of that kind of stillness. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I was doing my non-draw practice at that time, which is, the 100,000 mantras, 100,000 prostrations, 100,000 guru offerings. And I was well along the way, actually, on this. And then there was a point where I needed to go back to the West for 6 months for family reasons. And I couldn't take all this paraphernalia. And I said, like where I'm going, Vancouver, we don't have the dung of tan cows to clean my mandala plate. And then not Geshe Vaptan, but one of the junior teachers said to me, well, you're going to lose all the benefits, all the merit from your entire nundra. And I thought, oh, no, that can't be true. So I did actually go back to Canada for a short period. And then I came back, and I also went to Bodh Gaya, and I started doing more 10-day retreats, personal retreats, longer retreats. And, I found this this merging of the kind of altruism of the Tibetan teachings and the very down-to-earthness of the insight styles to be this most wonderful, magical combination. You didn't get absorbed in kind of, me, because it was all a bigger picture than that. I mean, something that's probably worth mentioning is that, in those days, you didn't have interviews. You didn't have individual meetings with teachers, You didn't have, I didn't anyway, I didn't have group interviews, In fact, nobody had the slightest interest in my personal story. Nobody had the slightest interest in it. They were not interested in listening to my personal story. And I remember once raising something from, my history with Goenka, and he looked at me just bewildered, like, why are you talking about that? Which, I'm sure many of you would say this is not a good approach, because sometimes we need to actually talk about our personal story. But there was also a benefit to it, because I think there was a sense of, the insights weren't just about personal insights. They would come. Emotional and psychological insights would come. But what was stressed was that what was really liberating, or most deeply liberating, was the understanding of the dharma. And, that kind of continued throughout my whole training life. So I spent, again, quite a long period of time in retreat undertaking insight practice training in somewhat different styles. And then a good period of time doing samadhi practice. And finding that to be really beneficial.
Yeah, because Goenka was in effect my first real teacher. A lot of my context for understanding the kind of the vision of the practice came from him. And the first night of my first intensive retreats, this is January 7th, 1971, Goenka said, the Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The Buddha taught a way of life. So these methods, these practices are available. They're open to anybody, regardless of faith tradition or not being rooted in another faith tradition. And that became really my foundational understanding. And so sometimes, all these years later, when I get asked questions about, what do you think about secular mindfulness? There's a part of me that responds, that says, I've always thought of it as secular because of Goenka, because of that approach. Not that it's alienated from Buddhist tradition. And I've been practicing within various elements of that tradition for so long now that that's the language I feel most comfortable using, or the stories or the imagery. But he really planted the seed that these are universal understandings and do not have to be, held in a kind of Buddhist orientation. So I'm wondering about how often you get asked about secular mindfulness.
I do. And I feel somewhat similar to you. I mean, I don't use the term secular mindfulness so much. I think more about mindfulness in secular settings. Mm-hmm. That's the reality. I mean, mindfulness awareness is cultivated in such a huge range of settings now that are, very much rooted in our culture, rooted in our time, and yet still deeply rooted in people's wish to be free from suffering. If I was, if I really thought about it, and I have thought about it, if I was going to be teaching a retreat at IMS for 100 people, if I would ask the question, how many people in this room would relate to themselves as being a Buddhist? I bet it would be a very small proportion. Mm-hmm. And yet it's almost like there's a sort of feeling, well, maybe I need to be a Buddhist to do this. What does being a Buddhist look like even? I mean, the Buddha, certainly I agree, did not teach a religion. He taught a way of life. He taught a path. The whole idea of Buddhism came in quite a bit later. And of course, in some cultures, it is very much a religion. But I don't think that's its roots. I think the Buddha was not interested in having legions of followers or adorers or devotees. I think the Buddha was really passionately interested in having graduates. People who came to the same understandings that he'd come to. People who could come to the same awakening that he'd come to know. And for me, that's the great gift of this teaching. It's not about being a follower, it's about being a graduate. And I know it's not, maybe not such common language in our times, but, the whole idea of awakening is so central to this teaching. And, it's not just about the capital A awakening. It's about, I think, the many awakenings that we can cultivate in our life if we bring what's needed, and when the Buddha said, I teach just one thing, that there's dukkha and there's an end of dukkha, and that dukkha is to be understood, not to be transcended, not to be suppressed, but to be understood and to find a way to, and that dukkha has roots, distress and dukkha has roots, and that's what we're asked to understand if we're to be free of dukkha. And for me, this has always been the great draw, the great magnetism, the great, the heart of this teaching, is about how do we wake up? How do we be more awake? How do we generate less dukkha? How do we swim in less dukkha? And what kind of footprint do we leave on the world? I mean, I don't know how it is for you, Sharon, but I find that many, many people speak to me about their practice, but not so many people speak to me about their path. And yet when we look at what the Buddha taught, he wasn't that fascinated with people having endless, amazing meditation experiences. His commitment was, how do you live? What kind of difference do you make in the world? What kind of footprint do you leave on the world? What kind of footprint do you leave on your own heart and mind? And when we look at the path, there's nothing that's left out. Our speech, our actions, our choices, our livelihood, our relationships, everything is in the path.
And also listening to you, I'm thinking about the many translations of the word dukkha, which is a Pali word, language of the original Buddhist texts, and the old-fashioned translations, which I like a lot, are dukkha is suffering, not just terrible, awful tragedy, or horrible injury, but insecurity and instability and uncertainty, the things that are much more subtle, but also included in the word suffering. And very contemporary translations from far, far better scholars than I. I'm not a scholar at all. Say stress, and I don't really like stress. I like suffering as a translation, but it is the point, and what Christina is saying, Christina, I would completely agree. It's a holistic view of what causes us to suffer. And the end of suffering for ourselves is not a selfish pursuit, because we live differently when we have an understanding of what brings us suffering and what brings us freedom from suffering. And it's not about being selfish or self-centered. It's something very different than that. But that's one of my things, is the translation of the word dukkha.
I have a thing about it. I mean, in apparently from the Pali, the word dukkha more or less translates as a bumpy ride. You know,
Yeah.
and the image that's used is of, a square axle on a cart being put through these round holes. And so when the cart moves, it bumps along, and I find that really quite helpful. These days, I tend to use the word vulnerability as a translation.
Mm-hmm.
That as human beings, we're vulnerable. This is a universal story, We're born, we're vulnerable to aging, sickness, and death, the pain of pain. We're vulnerable to the impact of change, impermanence, sometimes welcome, sometimes unwelcome, but none of us are exempt. We're vulnerable to the reality that we live in a world of shifting conditions, many of which we cannot control. And I think we also have a kind of inherited vulnerability to centralizing a view of self, and particularly centralizing a view of an insufficient self. Now, vulnerability, I feel, is something that's, it's not bad, it's not good, it's just how it is. And we're not trying to become invulnerable. But in the midst of that vulnerability, what we're really endeavoring, I think, to do is to cultivate the balance of heart, the understanding, the courage, the compassion, the kindness that allows us to meet that vulnerability in a more fearless way and in a less aversive way. That we kind of, I think that, at the heart of the path, we stopped thinking that we're the one person who has an exemption card from dukkha. We realized, no, this is me too. Me too. And how do I meet that in my life? How do I live that understanding? And knowing that the Buddha didn't speak about, liberation out. The Buddha, you think about the early days that when the Buddha lived, so much was spoken of transcendence, transcendence of the body, transcendence of the world, transcendence of relationship, that all of this was considered to be something of an obstacle. And the Buddha really changed the language. And he really changed the thinking. He didn't stop talking about transcendence, but he talked about transcendence of dukkha in the midst of the life we live. So, the part of dukkha that's really interesting that's spoken about is called sankhata dukkha, or the dukkha of patterns. And that's that whole layer of, this shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't be happening to me. The whole aversion, the whole anxiety, the whole fear layer, which, of course, this is what can end. Transcendence of dukkha doesn't mean that we stop being vulnerable, but we do start putting down the argument, because that's actually sometimes we can really struggle with pain and illness and loss and change. But we really struggle so much with all of our ideas that this shouldn't be happening. And it shouldn't be happening to me. And those ideas is actually what takes us out, I think, of the field of compassion, because compassion is recognizing that universal vulnerability, including ourselves. And it's not kind of trying to, be the first one on the lifeboat. It's actually saying that we're in this together. We're in this together. And in the midst of this life right now, however it is, can we not lose sight of the possibility of putting down those patterns of reactivity and those patterns of selfing?
I was thinking about compassion also in listening to you, because if the kind of reflection that can help propel us into loving kindness is that all beings want to be happy, the reflection that can help propel us into compassion is that all beings are vulnerable. Not that we suffer, to precisely the same degree or amount, because clearly we don't, but that vulnerability is universal. And here we are, it's in the very nature of things, and we can find ourselves in one another in that. and have a compassionate response. I know that you and I also, we must have begun teaching in almost the same time in our lives. And I'm wondering, in terms of your teaching in current time, I know you've done a lot in terms of combining practice with study. And I'm wondering if you have a kind of a favorite environment to teach in, whether it's in retreats or workshops, if there's certain populations you feel drawn to at this point to try to emphasize in your teaching.
I mean, my teaching life and context have changed considerably. I mean, I think for decades, my primary medium was the medium of retreats, of silent retreats. And I have enormous respect for that medium, and I think we all benefit. But these days it's different. In the silent retreat, you give dharma talks, you give discourses. Most of my teaching right now is through Bodhi College, something that I helped to found, which is really kind of rooted in really bringing the early texts, the Pali Canon, to life. What does it look like in our lives today? So my teaching environments now are a lot this kind of medium of this hybrid, where there's periods of silence and practice, and then much more extended periods of teaching on a particular theme. So I have days, where we stay with, a particular exploration. I really love that now, having the chance to focus and to go into something much more deeply. And they're always co-teaching situations. So, I have a number of friends and colleagues that we co-teach together. And much of our teaching is actually in this kind of style, where we're basically having a conversation with each other about a particular theme. It might be about the 5 spiritual powers, but we're essentially having a conversation with each other. And for me, this is what really enlivens me, because we don't have much in the way of notes. You have to trust that you know something about this. We have this dialogue that where we're kind of learning from each other. It's very inspiring. And, our students tell us that, they get inspired by listening to more than one voice in a dialogue or a discussion. And I'm doing a lot with more extended programs. In Bodhi College, we tend to have more extended programs. So there's something so lovely about getting to know a group of people over an extended period of time. It might be a year and a half. It might be a year. Even now, sometimes I'm doing programs online that are just a month long, once a week for a month. But, I get to know people. I get to hear more from the people that are listening. So it's much more engaged. There's a lot of time of reflection and questions and discussion. And I like to think, I like to feel, and I think it's true that this is actually really helpful to a lot of people. And they're experienced people. They're not people who are just, new to the practice. They've done a lot of silent retreats. And it's just kind of an extension of learning and context, I think. Like we didn't invent any of this stuff. Yeah. What we're talking about is, talked about 2,600 years ago, but how we bring it to life and how we translate it in a way that's really helpful to people in the times that we live in. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to maybe continue for a little bit, have another sitting, and then I want to remind you that you can, all of you listening, can put questions into the Q&A button, or if you can't figure that out, I hear sometimes it's not available on every Zoom or something like that, but it should be here. And if you can't find it or it doesn't work for you, you can certainly put a question into the chat so we can open up the conversation in that way. So I find that in terms of populations and in terms of what I'm drawn to, Of course, there's whatever I teach mostly is just open to whoever's interested in coming, but I find myself working most particularly with groups of caregivers, people who, whether in their personal lives or their professional lives, in some ways are on like the front lines of suffering, trying to make a difference in someone's life or some people's lives. Because I'm really fascinated by questions of compassion and empathy and burnout, and how people who care so much and trying to make a difference really are so often burning out, not from lack of caring by any means, which they have in abundance, but in Buddhist terminology, we might say more balance, more equanimity, compassion for oneself as well as for others, or having a realistic sense of limits, and not marching into a situation saying, I'm going to fix it by tonight, is really called for. And so I wonder how you define the word equanimity and what you say about it.
Upeka. I mean, it's interesting that the Pali word translates both as equanimity and as indifference. It's the same word. But clearly what the Buddha was speaking about, I mean, any of you who know anything about the teachings will know how highly treasured equanimity is. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with nibbana. I think of equanimity not as a state, but as an embodied understanding. When I really understand about dukkha, when I really understand about, change and non-self, that's a lived understanding that allows me to be equally near all things without taking it all so personally, without getting knocked off balance. And I think of equanimity, in terms of, the joys and sorrows part of all of our lives. Are we really willing to meet both equally? I think about equanimity in relationship to others. The Buddha didn't speak so much about that. And yet it's really critical in our lives, isn't it? Our interpersonal equanimity. To really understand, I can be as caring and as loving as I can possibly be, and I don't have the power to change the course of another person's mind. I could be surrounded by people who are caring and loving. They don't have the power to change the course of my mind. There's a kind of freedom in that. I can understand another's mind, but I don't feel this need to feel I can make them different. They can do that. We can provide the resources, we can provide everything possible. But there's a certain balance that comes into relationships, forgiveness, generosity, kindness. I think when we realize we can't really do that. I think also of equanimity as, profound inner stillness. There's a whole discourse in the Udanas in praise of equanimity, where the Buddha speaks of equanimity as having been the relinquishing of craving and ill will. There's quite a bit of freedom in that. So there's so many different layers, I think, to equanimity, and they're all equally important. And I think equanimity begins to be learnt in the classroom of the moments when we find ourselves getting knocked off balance. Then we start to look, well, what's really doing that? The conditions might be really hard, the situation might be really hard, but is it my craving that's making it me, rock and tremble? Is it my aversion? Is it my selfing? Is it because I have this insistence that another person has to be different than they are in this moment? What is really knocking me off balance in that world of reactivity? And does that actually help me to actually really face and be with the difficult and the challenging? I don't think it does. Yeah, I don't think it does. So for me, equanimity is really, it's an embodied insight. It's an embodied understanding that's learned in those classrooms when we rock and we falter and we fall. That's where we learn about equanimity. Sometimes it's very hard won, equanimity. It's a very hard one. How do you feel about it, Sharon?
Well, I'm more and more intrigued by the quality and think about it as balance and the kind of balance. Like when I first heard the word balance as a translation, I thought, well, that's dreary, like who wants to be balanced? It's translated in my mind as mediocrity, but the older I get and the more I see situations where I need, and we seem to need a kind of balance, to have a longer term perspective, to have any perspective at all, to remember things change, to not reify or concretize certain things and hold them as permanent, to hold different things at the same time. I often think of the yin yang symbol, where there's that kind of light, squiggly part, and right in the center is the circle of darkness, and then there's the dark, squiggly part, and there's a circle of light right in the center of that. And this is also true, we can be so contentious and so divided in so many ways, but to have, in effect, a heart as wide as the world, to be able to hold all elements of reality at once, I think it's so essential. And because I do get so much out of working with those populations of people who are caring for other people, and there's so much kind of emphasis in the culture about how we need empathy training, which is certainly true in general, because it's a pretty cold and cruel world without empathy. But really, these people, as we know, have so much empathy, and that's not the issue. They're suffering because of some kind of balance that's needed and could be achieved, so that that work can flourish and they can flourish in doing the work. And just being, I'm now, it's one of my favorite words when I used to disdain it. And ultimately, like balance, like who wants to get up earlier in the morning to be more balanced, It made no sense to me, but now it makes all the sense to me. So it's something that's hard to explain because it's such a weird concept for us. And I want to ask you one more question before we sit together, because you mentioned dharma talks and how you don't really give them so much anymore. You have conversations, which I think is a beautiful evolution, So I remember when I was first teaching, and I too was only teaching in retreat formats where there is a kind of formula often where we practice during the day. There'd be questions and answers. There'd be some contact with a teacher in one form or another. And then at night, there is the lecture, the Dharma talk. And the first retreat I was ever a part of, I was teaching with Joseph Goldstein. It was a month-long retreat. And it must have been 1974. It was the first time either of us had really taught a retreat in the States. And so 30-day retreat meant 30 talks. And I was absolutely petrified of public speaking. I could not give a talk. And Joseph had to give 30 talks. And so people were going up and yelling at him, saying, "Why won't you let her have a voice? Why won't you let her speak?" And he'd say, "I'd love a night off. Talk to her." But I was absolutely terrified. And what I was afraid of most was that I would sit up there and my mind would go blank. And I'd just be sitting there looking like a fool. And it took a long time and a lot of actually loving kindness practice to understand in a way their conversations. I'm not trying to impress anybody with my expertise. It's like, it's okay. There was more a sense of, here we are together, rather than they're sitting out there waiting to judge me. And I need to be perfect, which I am not. So I'm wondering, when you look back at your earliest teaching, if you felt any particular obstacles or, things that have just fallen away
Probably the same as you, Sharon. In my early years, offering a Dharma talk was like the worst possible experience, and it was all about having to do it perfectly or having to do it as well as somebody else or having to get it right. And I remember one time giving a Dharma talk, and I suddenly realized I'm not doing this because I'm trying to teach you something. I'm doing this because I really love this material. And it just fell away. It just fell away, and suddenly I felt this tremendous sense of actually quite joyfulness in giving a Dharma talk, like this was something so precious to share. And, whatever way, it didn't matter whether people liked it or didn't like it. That wasn't really the point. I was really almost talking to myself. So, and that was just also just the one piece I just wanted to highlight a little bit before we end this part, Sharon, is these days I talk much more about joyfulness. I think too many people have a joyfulness deficit, and in the teachings, joyfulness and compassion are married together. This is what resources us to show up for suffering, to show up for the difficult. And it's not like you can make yourself joyful, but mindfulness teaches us to make room for joyfulness. How to appreciate, how to be grateful, how to celebrate. All of those things that during the pandemic, I was doing not as much as you, but I was doing some teaching for frontline health service nurses who were really in just the worst situations. And I never suggested to them that they should go and sit more. I said, you should make some time every day where you connect with something that brings a smile to your heart, that gladdens your mind, because this is what's going to enable you to show up next day for all of this suffering. So these days, I'm a great advocate of cultivating more joyfulness in our lives, not as an escape, not as something frivolous, not as something that ignores dukkha, but as a way of resourcing ourselves inwardly.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So would you like to lead another meditation? Maybe 10 minutes or so? We have some questions that are already coming in. So
there's actually quite a few in the chat.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, maybe they're coming for you directly in the chat, and there's some that's coming in the Q&A button. So how about 10 minutes, something like that?
A little bit, maybe a little bit less, so that we have
maybe
some
a little
time.
bit less. Okay.
So let's come back again, come back into a place of collectedness. Having the intention to collect and to gather and to unify this body, mind, and present moment. Just letting the thoughts, no matter how pressing, of past or future, or preoccupations in the present, just allowing them to be whispers in the background of our attention. Foregrounding a sense of being present, just as wholeheartedly as we can be. And listening inwardly to the life of our body, to the life of our mind-heart. Listening to that which has a taste of loveliness and that which seems less lovely. Listening equally to everything we welcome and listening to that which feels less welcome. Appreciating the stillness, appreciating the calming, appreciating the body, the mind.
Thank you so much for that. Because the questions coming in the chat perhaps are coming in directly to you. Maybe I'll start with some of the ones that have come in the Q&A button, because there are a couple of questions that are similar to one another about what you said, Christina, about hearing concerns about being on the path less commonly than you hear concerns about meditation and what is practice off and on the cushion. And then someone else very specifically says, I appreciate your comments, Christina, about practice being a life path. For many years, my practice was daily sitting along with retreats, but now for health reasons, I can no longer attend live retreats, and even online retreats a difficulty because my wife is disabled and I have to attend to her periodically. Can you say more about how to cultivate deeper practice development within daily life?
Okay. Do you want to start, Sharon?
No, I'm very eager to hear you.
Well, I mean, the one thing I would like to say is I find it helpful in my own path to have more specificity around intention. Like I will have 2 intentions that I'm practicing with at one time. One will be a meditative intention on the cushion, and one will be a life intention. So the life intention is something that I wake up with in the morning and take into my day. And it'll be quite specific. It won't be generalized like, oh, I'm going to be really mindful today. It'll be quite specific. Like one that I've been actually practicing, a life intention I've been practicing with for actually a couple of years now because it's so enriching, is not to have any more neutral people in my life. So doesn't mean I go pursuing people with metta, by the way, but it does mean that when I pass people in the supermarket or on the cycle path, my intention is to actually see them, to see their humanity, to smile when it's appropriate, to say hello. And then recently when I found myself spending more time like in London, in a big city where there seems to be a collective intention about pretending that everybody else is invisible, I decided I'm not going to give it up. I'm going to continue this. So, I do on the underground train, on the street, and I find it's not about what it does for somebody else. I mean, it is quite amazing sometimes how much people appreciate being seen. But it also does something about how I focus my mind. It can be a specific intention, if you're caring for someone. How grounded am I in my body as I do this? Or, and just stay with that for a period of time. Let it get into your bones, or how am I listening? Stay with it for a while, So specificity of intention is what allows qualities to develop and to mature. And this takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes some consistency. So my encouragement would be to be, just find an intention that illuminates something that you're doing every day. And just set the intention, set the reminders if you need to, put it on your fridge, put it on your, wherever. This is the intention of the day. And remember that intentions are not something we just set once and then they're there. We renew intentionality, 100 times in a single day. I recommend staying with something for, several months, even longer. Just really, it becomes an investigation. It's illuminating. It's illuminating.
I love that. I really think that's fantastic. And it's an important arena I've discovered to learn not judging myself, but like listening to you, Christina, I thought about in the beginning of the pandemic when my life just looked very different than I expected it to look. I was up in Barrie, not in New York, and I was not traveling. And the center was closed, and everything was so different. And I thought about bringing practice into my daily life in a kind of renewed way, and one of the things I resolved was whenever I wrote out an email, not to press send right away, but to take a few breaths and to reread it, and then to decide, do I actually want to send it as written, or is this, because it's such a funny medium, I thought, is this open to be misinterpreted? Maybe I should rewrite this a little bit, and I often would. And it became a very regular practice of mine.
Yeah. I had an intention one year of giving up hurrying for a year. It was actually so wonderful. I never took it up again, the hurrying. But it does take time and practice and dedication, I think, to allow this, because we know that the whole of the path is led by intentions, skillful, wise intention. And to highlight that a little bit more in our lives, I think is really helpful.
I have some more, unless you have some that came in.
No, there's just one. There's actually only one question in the chat. The rest of it is more greetings. Shall I go with that?
Yeah, sure.
How do I appreciate the body and the mind when I'm so distracted by physical pain? The pain robs me of my finer attention. Well, you use the word distracted by the pain, but I think what you're saying is that the pain keeps drawing your attention to it because of its intensity. There's a real skillfulness, I think, in this path about knowing when to stay with something and when not to stay with something. I personally find there's little value in being overwhelmed. And if you're under-resourced, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by physical pain. So, you might look at actually what would it be for you to actually sometimes to take your attention elsewhere. The Buddha speaks of this as, wise action. Take my attention elsewhere. What's missing right now? What quality of heart mind is missing right now? Is it more space? Is it more joyfulness? Is it more kindness? What can I attend to with my eyes, with my ears, with more wholeheartedness? You're not kind of doing some spiritual sin. According to the Buddha, there is sometimes something called wise avoidance. The other thing that I find in teaching is that when you're living with a lot of ongoing physical pain, to really appreciate coexistence. What in your body right now does not hurt? You're always going to find a place that's not in pain. Your earlobes, the back of your hand. And to move your attention between what is actually well and what is painful, so that your being with the painful is far more conscious and intentional rather than just being dragged to it, and that your attention is also, you appreciate you have the power to choose what you attend to in this moment. This is one of the great gifts of mindfulness, and you can attend to that which is well and then return to that which is difficult. So learning something about coexistence, I think, in the midst of chronic pain is really helpful.
And I would also just add to that, that we use physical pain sometimes as a template for how to work with emotional pain. It's all the same principles, like getting exhausted, getting overwhelmed is not going to be that helpful. And learning to titrate, to move your attention between something that's at least neutral and perhaps pleasant to what is painful will really help a lot. Things like that. There's a question that came in. Can you talk about emptiness as a practice? Which I thought was very interesting, because I've been thinking about asking Christina this question myself in a way that, they say there are 3 characteristics of life that insight meditation really comes to: deeply, deeply understanding impermanence, deeply understanding dukkha, or suffering, and all those different manifestations, and deeply understanding selflessness or emptiness. And any one of these can be a doorway to liberation. Any one of these, in a way, brings the others. But it is also taught that sometimes we have a stronger affinity toward one rather than the other two, and that's fine. Like, for me, when I would first hear teachings about selflessness or emptiness, I would think, what are they talking about? Whereas dukkha, I got it from the beginning, and that's just why I went to India, and remained a real doorway to much deeper understanding for me. And I remember talking to a friend who said to me that when he first heard teachings about emptiness, he so knew it was true. He said it was like the hairs on his body stood up. And all I could think of was, I'm sitting there thinking, what are they talking about? But as my understanding of dukkha and impermanence grew, I found a doorway into understanding emptiness, which had to do with interconnection, because emptiness doesn't mean everything disappears or becomes blank, but the world arises because of interconnection, interdependence. So it's like another face. So reflecting on interdependence, reflecting on not being in control is one of the early insights into emptiness or selflessness, that there doesn't seem to be a little being in there pulling the strings. Seeing the nature of the relationship between the mind and the body, how a sensation in the body leads to a thought in the mind, the thought in the mind leads to a different sensation. And so there are lots of ways through interconnection and relationship to reflect on emptiness. So I was going to ask you, Christina, earlier, actually, did you have a favorite insight that led you to the others?
I don't know about favorite. I mean, the concept of emptiness, that all conditioned phenomena are empty of self. In the early days, when I first started hearing the teachings on the three characteristics, that always seemed to me to be the most sort of dramatic and romantic one to go for, like this was really, almost felt like this was like somehow the higher teaching. But as you say, they're not hierarchical, and they're not linear, and I think it was probably part of my mind in those times that was less interested in looking at dukkha, and perhaps saw emptiness as a way of evading dukkha. So, I think it took some time for that to register a little bit, but I don't have a hierarchy. I mean, I don't think it's an accident, actually, that when you see the three characteristics listed in the text, it's always anicca, dukkha, anatta. It's always, change, dukkha, emptiness, or emptiness of self. And I don't think that's an accident, because I think, what is really visible to us and available to us, it's impermanence. None of us has to look very far for that, do we? None of us has an intellectual disagreement that all things change, that there's nothing permanent. We get this. We might not live it, but we know it. And I think part of the path is moving from the knowing to the living of it, and then once we can live that, I think that the balance, the steadiness of mind to really explore dukkha and emptiness of self is much more available to us. But again, it's not necessarily hierarchical. For some people, a lot of people begin their path with dukkha, don't they? I mean, what initially brought you to the path? What brought you to your first retreat? Wasn't because you lived in some idyllic happiness, probably, and we're seeking to deepen that. That's true for a few people, by the way. Most people come because, something is amiss. Something is amiss. We also know about dukkha. Whereas emptiness of self sometimes seems like it's more complex, but not in the Buddhist thinking. I think in the Buddhist thinking, emptiness of self is as obvious and evident if we look closely as anicca and dukkha is. We're just not looking closely enough, or we don't want to look closely enough to imagine somehow these these constructions of selfing. We don't want to imagine them not being as solid as we might like them to be.
And another question, someone once said to the person writing the question, I think all human reactions boil down to fear and joy. What do you think of fear as a translation of dukkha?
No, I personally, I wouldn't put it in that category. I think in the early teachings, fear is very much the part of the aversion spectrum. That most ill will and most aversion is born of a fear of injury. It's obviously such a very central human anxiety thing, isn't it? You know, fear of being injured, fear of being hurt, you know, physically, psychologically, emotionally, through change, through loss. You know, it's such a driver. And what do we do with fear? Either we become paralyzed, we run, or we fight. And so it's very much part, I mean, and all of that is dukkha. You know, it's not like it's separate from dukkha. All of that is dukkha. But the Buddha spoke of fear as being much more in that spectrum that keeps creating and recreating dukkha, rather than being dukkha. It is dukkha, but it creates and recreates dukkha. It's part of that fuel, that impetus that keeps dukkha being repetitive in our lives. I mean, that would be my sense.
Mm-hmm. And then another question for you, Christina. I recently re-listened to a 2016 weekend you offered to SIMS, Seattle Insight Meditation, on Nibbana. For a long time, I've used Joseph's understanding of small moments many times. Would you please comment on that and offer any insights about moments of freedom?
Well, I mean, I agree with Joseph. I mean, it's very easy to make Nibbana so mystical and distant and remote that it feels impossible for us, but it is the third ennobling truth. You know, it's good to remember that, you know, the whole path is actually meant to be leading towards Nibbana. But I also think that Nibbana is something we practice. I think it's something we practice. We learn to practice liberation. You know, what does it mean to liberate the moment we're in? From greed, from ill will, from fear, from reactivity. What does it mean to liberate this moment from those patterns that create and recreate dukkha? So it's something that we're practicing, and you know, as the Buddha put it, whatever we feed will grow. You know, whatever we frequently think about and dwell upon, to this will our mind incline. I think it'd be good to think a little bit more about Nibbana, you know, and how to incline the mind in that direction, in that way, by practicing it. You know, I don't think it's rocket science. You know, if I walk out if I go out in my car and somebody cuts in front of me, what am I going to practice in that moment? You know? Impatience, judgment, aversion, or am I going to practice? Okay, patience, generosity, carefulness. But what am I going to practice in that moment? You know, these are kind of like, we're not talking about all the huge moments. We're talking about the small moments in our day where we kind of default to patterns that really don't serve us well. And we know it. And it's a habit.
Until you've been in a city a lot, when someone cuts in front of you in traffic. Those examples. Okay, one last question. Are there other yearly intentions of yours, Christina, that you might share with us?
Well, as I say, I've been hanging out with no more neutral people in my life for quite a while. I mean, I had a year of not hurrying. I had a year of not keeping anything I didn't really need. That was really good. I mean, I went a little bit over the top because I emptied my filing cabinet and took it all to the recycling center, including the information I needed for my tax return. But yeah, as a general intention, it was really good. Not keeping anything I didn't really need. I've had the intention of practicing wise speech. That was a very rich exploration. So sometimes I'll keep an intention for longer than a year because, I find that it's very fertile territory for changing habits. Changing habits is good for all of us if they're not useful to us.
Fabulous. I think we need to stop, but it is so wonderful to hear you and see you, Christina, and thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Christina's work, you can check out the show notes for today's episode and link over to the IMS website. She's also got lots of great books out there, so there's lots of ways to connect with her. For all things Sharon, including the February Meditation Challenge or any of her other online events that are coming up, you can visit SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe, may you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.